The Baltic in winter feels endless and merciless. From the depths a shadow rises, and in that moment, the fate of thousands changes course. The name you will hear at the start of our story is Alexander Marinesko. His choices in the darkest days of the war turned an ordinary patrol into an event still debated to this day. What did the commander truly see through the periscope, and why did one precise strike become a symbol not only of tactics, but of a moral dilemma? Why was a hero with flawless instincts erased from honor rolls, and who needed his silence? We will show the chronicle of disaster without shocking details, but with facts that chill the heart. We will uncover how the hunt for a major target led to consequences the newspapers never printed. And most importantly, we will reach an answer that many avoid. Watch until the end, because the finale breaks the familiar myth and reveals the man behind the legend in a new light. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Alexander Ivanovich Marinesko was born on the 2nd of January 1913 in the bustling port of Odessa. His father Ion, a Romanian merchant sailor, filled their home with stories of distant voyages, while his Russian mother Tatiana believed the sea was his inevitable fate. For young Alexander, salt air and tar became as familiar as bread on the family table. The port city itself served as his first classroom. From childhood, he wandered the docks, watching crews from every corner of the world, memorizing the language of knots, rigging, and silent gestures between sailors. He listened closely to tales of storms, dangers, and discoveries, shaping in his mind a vision of life at sea. By his teenage years, Alexander stood tall and lean, with sharp eyes that seemed to measure everything around him. Confidence came naturally, though it masked a streak of independence that often clashed with authority. His real education unfolded not in schoolrooms, but on the waterfront. He learned to read storms from seabirds, to gauge a vessel's condition by the thrum of its engines, and to sense the fine line between bravery and recklessness. Choosing his path required no hesitation. Naval school was not ambition, but destiny, and the Soviet Navy, eager for talent during Stalin's modernization, accepted him readily. Life at the academy suited him. He excelled in navigation and tactics, displaying a natural gift for submarine warfare. Instructors noted his calm in confined, high-pressure conditions, a quality vital for men who lived beneath the sea. Fellow cadets remembered him less for speeches than for action. He inspired through competence, solving problems when exercises faltered, steadying morale when icy drills wore others down. By the time he graduated in 1933, Marinesko carried all the tools of a successful officer: skill, discipline, and faith in his own judgment. What he lacked was political caution, a flaw that would one day prove costly. When Germany began Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Alexander Marinesko served as senior lieutenant aboard submarine M96. The Baltic Fleet at once found itself in a deadly trap. German forces held most of the coastline, turning the sea into what sailors bitterly called a German lake. Conditions for Soviet submariners were extreme. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies. Anti-submarine nets sealed harbor exits, and acoustic mines waited in every shipping lane. Most dangerous of all, the Baltic's shallow waters offered almost no depth to hide a submarine under attack. During his first patrol on M96, Marinesko learned lessons no academy could teach. He ignored official instructions that demanded surfacing to fight with deck guns, a tactic doomed against constant air patrols. Instead, he studied German patrol routes, waiting like a hunter for the weakest moment. He used rocky outcrops and sudden depth changes as cover, slipping away when sonar searched too close. In August 1941 came his first success. After 3 days of patient tracking, he launched 2 torpedoes that struck a German transport loaded with supplies. The battle lasted only minutes, but the preparation showed his precision and resolve. What marked him apart was his courage to risk what others avoided. While many Soviet crews stayed near safer waters, Marinesko drove deep into German-controlled zones where danger was constant, yet targets plentiful. His men soon believed in his instinct, saying he sensed threats before the instruments did, and always knew when to strike or retreat. By early 1942, his reputation was firmly established. He achieved more than older officers, and his methods were studied by fellow captains. Yet this same independence brought friction. He questioned foolish orders, altered plans from headquarters, and dismissed the political rituals expected of Soviet commanders. These traits that made him brilliant at sea would soon bring conflict with his own superiors. In December 1942, Alexander Marinesko received orders that would define the remainder of his career and legacy. The Baltic Fleet Command assigned him as captain of submarine S-13, a newer vessel equipped with more powerful engines and advanced torpedo systems. For a 29-year-old officer, command of one of the fleet's most capable submarines represented both tremendous opportunity and equally tremendous responsibility. S-13 differed significantly from the smaller submarines Marinesko had previously commanded. Larger and more heavily armed, she carried a crew of 52 men and could remain submerged for extended periods. Her diesel engines provided the speed necessary to intercept fast-moving targets, while her electric motors enabled silent running when stealth became paramount. Marinesko approached his new command with characteristic intensity. He spent weeks familiarizing himself with every system, every pipe, every gauge aboard S-13. More importantly, he began the delicate process of molding his crew into the kind of precision instrument that submarine warfare demanded. His leadership style reflected his personality, demanding but fair, tough but protective of his men. Marinesko expected absolute competence from every crew member, but he also ensured they understood that their commander would never ask them to take risks he wouldn't share. During training exercises, he worked alongside ordinary seamen, learning their concerns and building the mutual trust essential for submarine operations. The crew of S-13 quickly discovered that their new captain possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense opportunity and danger. During their first combat patrol under Marinesko's command, they watched him guide the submarine through a complex minefield using instincts that seemed to transcend normal navigation techniques. When enemy vessels appeared, Marinesko's tactical decisions proved consistently sound. Aggressive when aggression served the mission, cautious when caution preserved the crew. What truly set Marinesko apart was his willingness to operate independently of fleet command when tactical situations demanded it. While other submarine commanders religiously followed predetermined patrol routes and schedules, Marinesko adapted his operations based on intelligence gathered during the mission itself. If German shipping patterns changed, he changed with them. If new opportunities arose, he seized them regardless of whether they fell within his official orders. This independence produced remarkable results. Under Marinesko's command, S-13 sank more enemy tonnage than any other Soviet submarine in the Baltic Fleet. His success rate attracted attention from senior naval officers, but it also generated suspicion among political commissars who questioned whether Marinesko's tactical flexibility masked dangerous individualism. The crew remained fiercely loyal to their captain, despite, or perhaps because of, his reputation for bending rules. They understood that Marinesko's unconventional methods kept them alive while maximizing their impact against enemy forces. When other submarines returned from patrols with empty torpedo tubes and no confirmed kills, S-13 consistently delivered results. By late 1944, Marinesko had transformed S-13 into one of the most feared predators in the Baltic Sea. German naval intelligence began specifically tracking the submarine's movements, recognizing that wherever S-13 appeared, enemy vessels would soon disappear. The reputation that would later prove so problematic in peacetime served Marinesko perfectly during the chaotic conditions of total war. Yet even as his tactical brilliance reached its peak, signs of future trouble were already visible. Marinesko's relationship with fleet political officers remained strained, marked by arguments over tactical decisions and complaints about his alleged lack of proper Soviet enthusiasm. The qualities that made him devastatingly effective against German targets, independence, tactical creativity, willingness to challenge authority, would soon bring him into direct conflict with the very system he served. The winter of 1945 brought desperation to the German war effort. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly through East Prussia, forcing massive evacuations of German civilians and military personnel. Operation Hannibal, the largest seaborne evacuation in history, aimed to transport millions of refugees to safety in Western Germany using every available vessel. Among these vessels, the Wilhelm Gustloff stood out as both salvation and target. Originally built as a cruise ship for the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, the Gustloff had been converted for wartime use. At over 25,000 tons and nearly 700 feet in length, she represented one of the largest vessels still operating in German waters. On the 30th of January, 1945, Wilhelm Gustloff prepared to depart from Gdynia harbor, carrying approximately 10,000 passengers. The exact number remains disputed. Passenger manifests were incomplete, and many people boarded without proper documentation in their desperation to escape the advancing Soviet army. What is certain is that the ship carried a mixture of wounded soldiers, naval personnel, and civilian refugees, including thousands of women and children. Alexander Marinesko had been prowling German shipping lanes for days without significant contact. His previous patrol had yielded disappointing results, and he felt pressure to justify S-13's operational costs. Soviet submarine doctrine emphasized tonnage sunk as the primary measure of success, and Marinesko needed a substantial target to maintain his reputation as an effective commander. Intelligence reports indicated increased German naval activity in the area, but these reports provided no specific information about individual vessels or their cargo. Marinesko positioned S-13 along likely shipping routes, using his accumulated knowledge of German evacuation patterns to predict where valuable targets might appear. The contact came at approximately 9 in the evening. S-13's sonar operator reported multiple large vessels moving northwest at moderate speed. Marinesko ordered the submarine to periscope depth for visual confirmation. Through the lens, he observed 3 ships, the largest displaying lights that violated standard wartime blackout procedures. According to international maritime law, hospital ships were required to display specific lighting patterns and carry appropriate markings to indicate their protected status. The Wilhelm Gustloff showed lights, but these appeared to be standard navigation lights rather than the distinctive red crosses required for medical vessels. To Marinesko, scanning the scene through his periscope, the ship presented itself as a legitimate military target. The tactical situation demanded immediate decision-making. The German vessels were moving at 12 knots through relatively calm seas, presenting an ideal attack profile for torpedo attack. S-13 carried a full load of torpedoes, and the range to target was optimal, close enough for accuracy, far enough to avoid immediate retaliation. Marinesko ordered his crew to battle stations and began calculating the attack parameters. The size and speed of the target required multiple torpedoes to ensure destruction. He decided to fire 4 torpedoes in a spread pattern, maximizing the probability that at least one would find its target. At approximately 23 hours on the 30th of January, S-13 fired 4 torpedoes at Wilhelm Gustloff. 3 struck the massive vessel along her port side, causing catastrophic damage that ensured rapid sinking. The ship listed heavily and began taking on water at a rate that made rescue operations nearly impossible. What followed ranks among the greatest maritime disasters in history. Wilhelm Gustloff sank in less than an hour, taking with her approximately 9,000 lives. The water temperature, barely above freezing, killed most survivors within minutes of entering the Baltic. Rescue vessels managed to save only about 1,000 people from the disaster. For Marinesko and his crew, the attack represented a tactical triumph of the highest order. They had successfully engaged and destroyed one of the largest enemy vessels encountered during the entire war. The tonnage sunk in a single attack exceeded the combined achievements of most submarine commanders during their entire careers. The human cost of this military success would not become fully apparent until after the war ended. At the time, Marinesko understood only that he had struck a devastating blow against German naval capacity and potentially shortened the war by disrupting enemy evacuation operations. Success breeds ambition, and Alexander Marinesko felt the intoxicating effects of his victory against Wilhelm Gustloff. Rather than returning immediately to base as many commanders might have done after such a significant achievement, he chose to remain in German waters seeking additional targets. This decision reflected both his aggressive tactical instincts and his understanding that opportunities for major attacks were becoming increasingly rare as the war neared its end. 10 days after the Gustloff attack, on February 9, 1945, S-13 sonar detected another large vessel moving through the same general area. The target proved to be General von Steuben, another large German ship participating in Operation Hannibal. Originally built as a passenger liner, she had been converted for military transport duties and was carrying approximately 4,000 passengers. Again, a mixture of wounded soldiers, naval personnel, and civilian refugees. Marinesko's approach to this second attack demonstrated the tactical lessons learned from his previous success. He positioned S-13 more carefully, taking additional time to ensure optimal firing position and escape route. The crew, now confident in their commander's abilities and their own skills, executed their duties with the precision that comes from recent victory. The attack commenced shortly after midnight. Marinesko fired 2 torpedoes at General von Steuben, both of which found their target. The ship's design and damage control systems proved inadequate to handle the flooding, and she sank within 7 minutes of being struck. The speed of the sinking left little time for organized evacuation, and approximately 3,000 passengers and crew perished in the icy waters. From a purely military perspective, Marinesko had achieved something unprecedented in submarine warfare. In the span of 10 days, operating alone in enemy-controlled waters, he had sunk 2 major vessels totaling approximately 40,000 tons. More tonnage than many entire submarine squadrons destroyed during the entire war. His tactical skills, combined with S-13's technical capabilities and his crew's competence, had produced results that military historians would later classify as the most successful submarine patrol in maritime history. The crew of S-13 understood the magnitude of their achievements. They had operated at the peak of submarine warfare effectiveness, demonstrating that Soviet naval forces could compete with the most advanced enemy fleets. The confidence and esprit de corps generated by these victories created an elite unit that other submarine crews regarded with mixture of admiration and envy. Yet even as Marinesko celebrated his tactical triumphs, the seeds of future problems were already germinating. Soviet naval doctrine emphasized collective achievement and adherence to central planning. Individual commanders who achieved dramatic success through independent action often found themselves viewed with suspicion by political officers who questioned whether such independence reflected dangerous tendencies towards self-aggrandizement. Moreover, the full human cost of Marinesko's victories remained unknown to Soviet command. The Wilhelm Gustloff and General von Steuben attacks had killed approximately 12,000 people, many of them civilians. While these casualties were legally justified under the laws of war, both vessels were legitimate military targets carrying armed personnel. The humanitarian implications would later complicate efforts to celebrate Marinesko's achievements. For the moment, however, Alexander Marinesko stood at the absolute pinnacle of his naval career. He had accomplished what submarine commanders dream of achieving: devastating attacks against major enemy targets, executed flawlessly under combat conditions. The young officer from Odessa, who had joined the Navy seeking glory, had found it in the cold waters of the Baltic Sea. Victory in war often proves more complicated than defeat, and Alexander Marinesko discovered this truth in the months following his greatest triumphs. When S-13 returned to Kronstadt Naval Base in February 1945, Marinesko expected the kind of recognition typically accorded to heroes of the Soviet Union. Instead, he encountered a response that ranged from lukewarm praise to active suspicion. The problem began with the nature of submarine warfare itself. Unlike tank battles or infantry assaults that generated dramatic stories and clear propaganda value, submarine victories occurred in isolation, witnessed only by crew members whose accounts were classified. The Soviet media machine, focused on highlighting collective achievements and party-approved heroes, struggled to incorporate individual submarine commanders into their narrative structure. More significantly, Marinesko's personality clashed fundamentally with Soviet military culture as it had evolved under Stalin. The paranoid atmosphere of the 1940s placed enormous emphasis on political reliability, unquestioning obedience to authority, and demonstrated loyalty to party principles. Marinesko possessed none of these qualities in the forms that political officers expected. His tactical independence, which had made him so effective against German targets, translated poorly to peacetime military service. Marinesko continued to question orders he considered tactically unsound, to modify official procedures based on his combat experience, and to prioritize military effectiveness over political correctness. These behaviors, tolerable during desperate wartime conditions, became problematic as the Soviet military transitioned to peacetime operations. Personal conflicts compounded these ideological problems. Marinesko had developed a reputation for heavy drinking and irregular personal conduct that embarrassed his superiors. Stories circulated about missed meetings, inappropriate relationships, and public arguments with senior officers. Whether these stories were entirely accurate mattered less than their effect on his professional standing. The contrast between Marinesko's tactical brilliance and personal reliability created cognitive dissonance within the naval command structure. How could someone so effective in combat prove so problematic in garrison? The answer, uncomfortable for a system that preferred clear categories, was that the qualities that made Marinesko an exceptional wartime commander, independent thinking, willingness to take risks, disregard for conventional authority, made him unsuited for the conformist requirements of Soviet peacetime military service. By late 1945, Marinesko found himself assigned to increasingly peripheral positions within the Baltic Fleet. his requests for meaningful commands were ignored or denied. Official recognition for his wartime achievements remained minimal. No Hero of the Soviet Union medal, no public celebrations, no promotion to positions befitting his tactical accomplishments. The bureaucratic machinery that should have celebrated Marinesko instead began building a case for his removal from naval service. Reports accumulated, citing his alleged unreliability, political shortcomings, and failure to demonstrate appropriate Soviet military values. These reports focused not on his tactical achievements, but on his personality defects and behavioral problems. Marinesko's response to this treatment revealed both his strengths and weaknesses as a leader. Rather than adapting his behavior to meet institutional expectations, he became increasingly defiant and bitter. He criticized the naval command openly, questioned the competence of officers who had achieved promotion through political rather than military means, and made no effort to disguise his contempt for the system that was marginalizing him. This defiance sealed his fate within the Soviet military hierarchy. By 1946, it became clear that Alexander Marinesko had no future as a naval officer, despite being arguably the most tactically gifted submarine commander in the Baltic Fleet. The same independence and tactical brilliance that had made him a terror to German shipping made him unacceptable to Soviet peacetime military culture. The irony was profound. The officer who had struck the most devastating blows against enemy naval forces found himself treated as a liability by his own navy. The man who had demonstrated absolute courage under enemy fire was considered unreliable by commanders who had spent the war in rear headquarters. The hero of the greatest submarine attacks in maritime history was being quietly pushed toward disgrace and obscurity. The transition from war hero to civilian proved even more difficult for Alexander Marinesko than his conflicts with naval authority. In 1946, facing inevitable dismissal from military service, he accepted discharge and attempted to build a new life outside the structured environment that had defined his adult existence. The Soviet Union of the late 1940s offered limited opportunities for former military officers whose service records were complicated by disciplinary problems. Marinesko's tactical brilliance meant nothing in civilian employment markets that valued political reliability and bureaucratic conformity. His reputation for independent thinking and conflicts with authority preceded him, making stable employment difficult to obtain. Initially, Marinesko found work in the merchant marine, hoping that his nautical expertise would translate into civilian maritime success. However, his problems with authority persisted even in commercial shipping. Merchant marine operations required the same kind of hierarchical discipline that had caused him trouble in naval service, and Marinesko proved no more willing to accept questionable orders from civilian supervisors than he had been from military commanders. His personal problems, manageable during wartime when combat missions provided focus and purpose, became overwhelming in the mundane environment of peacetime employment. Alcohol consumption, which had been occasional stress relief during combat operations, became a daily necessity for coping with the frustration and disappointment of his reduced circumstances. By 1949, Marinesko's life had deteriorated substantially. Unable to maintain steady employment, struggling with alcohol dependency, and increasingly bitter about the contrast between his wartime achievements and peacetime failures. He became the kind of troublesome veteran that Soviet authorities preferred to ignore or suppress. The situation reached its crisis point in 1950 when Marinesko was arrested on charges of embezzlement and abuse of official position. The specific details of these charges remain disputed. Some historians suggest they were fabricated or exaggerated for political purposes, while others maintain they reflected real criminal behavior. What seems certain is that Marinesko's reputation for unreliability and his conflicts with authority made him vulnerable to prosecution regardless of the actual facts involved. Soviet justice in the early 1950s operated according to political rather than legal principles. Marinesko's trial proceeded with the kind of predetermined outcome typical of the Stalin era. His wartime achievements, rather than serving as mitigating factors, were largely ignored or dismissed as irrelevant to his current circumstances. The man who had sunk more enemy tonnage than any other Soviet submarine commander was sentenced to 3 years in a Siberian labor camp. Prison camp life proved devastating for someone accustomed to command authority and respect. Marinesko, now approaching 40 years of age, found himself reduced to manual labor under conditions designed to break prisoners' spirits as well as their bodies. The contrast between his former status as an elite naval officer and his current circumstances as a common criminal created psychological trauma that would affect him for the remainder of his life. During his incarceration, the Cold War atmosphere ensured that Marinesko's wartime achievements remained classified and forgotten. Soviet propaganda focused on approved heroes whose personal lives reflected proper political values. A submarine commander with a criminal record and alcohol problems had no place in the official narrative of Soviet victory, regardless of his tactical accomplishments. Marinesko was released from prison in 1953, physically weakened and psychologically scarred by the experience. He returned to civilian life carrying the additional burden of a criminal record that made employment even more difficult to obtain. The few jobs available to ex-convicts were typically manual labor positions that provided subsistence wages and no opportunity for advancement. The final decade of Marinesko's life passed in increasing obscurity and poverty. He worked various low-skilled jobs when his health permitted, struggled with ongoing alcohol dependency, and lived in communal housing that reflected his marginal social status. The man who had once commanded one of the Soviet Navy's most advanced submarines spent his final years as a forgotten casualty of a system that had no use for inconvenient heroes. Alexander Marinesko died on November 25, 1963, at the age of 50, largely unknown and unmourned, except by a few surviving crew members who remembered their former commander's tactical brilliance. His death certificate listed him as a factory worker, with no mention of his naval service or wartime achievements. The greatest submarine commander in Soviet naval history had become a non-person, erased from official memory as thoroughly as if he had never existed. The process of rehabilitating Alexander Marinesko's reputation began slowly and cautiously during the Khrushchev era's partial de-Stalinization, but gained momentum only decades after his death. The initial breakthrough came from an unexpected source: former crew members of S-13 who had maintained contact with each other despite their commander's disgrace. These veterans, now reaching retirement age, began sharing their wartime memories with younger generations who had grown up hearing sanitized versions of naval history. Their accounts painted a dramatically different picture of Marinesko than the official narrative of an unreliable officer who had squandered his potential through personal failings. Former torpedo specialist Anatoly Krivalev was among the first to speak publicly about serving under Marinesko. His testimony emphasized the commander's tactical genius, his protective attitude toward crew members, and his ability to achieve results that other submarine commanders could not match. More importantly, Krivalev and other veterans provided specific details about the Wilhelm Gustloff and General von Steuben attacks that revealed their true significance. Military historians began examining wartime records more carefully, motivated partly by the veterans' testimonies and partly by changing political conditions that allowed more honest assessment of Soviet wartime performance. What they discovered contradicted decades of official silence about Marinesko's achievements. The tonnage figures alone were staggering. Marinesko's two major attacks had sunk approximately 40,000 tons of enemy shipping, more than most entire submarine squadrons achieved during the entire war. When combined with his other verified sinkings, his total approached 50,000 tons, making him statistically the most successful submarine commander in Soviet naval history. More significantly, historians began understanding the strategic context of Marinesko's attacks. Operation Hannibal represented Germany's desperate attempt to preserve military and civilian resources for continued resistance against Soviet forces. By disrupting this evacuation effort, Marinesko had contributed directly to shortening the war and reducing overall casualties. The rehabilitation process accelerated during the 1970s and 80s as Soviet military culture began emphasizing professional competence alongside political reliability. Submarine warfare, in particular, attracted renewed attention as the nuclear submarine program expanded Soviet naval capabilities worldwide. Naval Academy instructors began using Marinesko's tactical methods as case studies in submarine warfare, though initially without mentioning his name or personal history. His approach to target identification, attack positioning, and evasion techniques became part of standard curriculum, taught to new generations of submarine officers who had no idea they were learning from a disgraced veteran. The political breakthrough came during Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost period, when the Soviet media began acknowledging previously suppressed aspects of wartime history. Journalists investigating submarine warfare discovered Marinesko's story and recognized its dramatic potential. Here was a genuine war hero whose achievements had been covered up for political reasons. A 1986 article in Soviet Fleet magazine provided the first detailed public account of Marinesko's career, including specific information about his major attacks and their strategic significance. The article carefully avoided criticizing the system that had destroyed Marinesko's career, but clearly implied that a great injustice had been done to a deserving hero. Public response to these revelations was overwhelmingly positive. Soviet readers, increasingly cynical about official propaganda, responded enthusiastically to a story about genuine heroism that had been suppressed for political reasons. Marinesko became a symbol of the gap between reality and official narrative that characterized much of Soviet history. The momentum continued building through the late 1980s and early 1990s. Additional veterans came forward with their own memories of serving under Marinesko. Historians uncovered more documentation about his tactical innovations and strategic achievements. Military analysts began comparing his accomplishments to those of famous submarine commanders from other nations. In 1990, the Soviet government officially rehabilitated Alexander Marinesko, clearing his criminal record and acknowledging that his prosecution had been unjustified. This legal rehabilitation paved the way for full military recognition of his wartime achievements. The ultimate acknowledgement came on May 5, 1990, when Mikhail Gorbachev signed a decree posthumously awarding Marinesko the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The citation specifically mentioned his sinking of Wilhelm Gustloff and General von Steuben, acknowledging these attacks as among the most significant submarine victories of the Second World War. This recognition, coming 27 years after Marinesko's death, represented both vindication and tragedy. The submarine commander who had achieved the greatest tactical successes in Soviet naval history finally received the honor he had earned decades earlier, but only after a lifetime of disgrace and obscurity had already ended. The restoration of Alexander Marinesko's reputation inevitably generated debates about aspects of his story that official documentation could not resolve. Historians, journalists, and former naval personnel began examining not just what had happened, but why events had unfolded as they did, and whether alternative interpretations might explain the apparent contradictions in his career. The most persistent speculation centered on the nature of his wartime targets. While Wilhelm Gustloff and General von Steuben were legally legitimate military objectives under international law, their passenger manifests included thousands of civilian refugees. This fact created moral complexities that some observers found difficult to reconcile with heroic narratives. German naval historians, writing decades after the war, provided their own perspectives on Marinesko's attacks. Their accounts emphasized the humanitarian tragedy of the sinkings, while acknowledging that Marinesko had acted within the accepted parameters of submarine warfare. These German sources helped establish that both vessels were indeed carrying military personnel and equipment alongside civilian passengers. More controversial were suggestions that Soviet naval intelligence had provided Marinesko with specific information about his targets that was not reflected in official records. Some former intelligence officers claimed that submarine commanders received detailed briefings about high-value targets, including passenger manifests and cargo descriptions. If true, this would suggest that Marinesko knew exactly what he was attacking, making his decisions more calculated than spontaneous. Other speculation focused on Marinesko's relationship with Soviet political authorities. Some historians suggested that his post-war disgrace reflected not just personality conflicts, but deeper political considerations. According to this theory, Marinesko's attacks had created diplomatic complications with neutral nations that were managing refugee evacuations, and Soviet authorities chose to scapegoat the submarine commander rather than acknowledge policy problems. A related theory proposed that Marinesko's independence and tactical brilliance made him politically dangerous in peacetime. Stalin's paranoia about military heroes who might challenge party authority was well documented, and several successful wartime commanders had suffered similar fates. Marinesko's case might have reflected systematic policy rather than individual personality conflicts. Personal speculation about Marinesko's character generated equally heated debates. Some former crew members portrayed him as an inspirational leader whose only flaw was excessive honesty in a dishonest system. Others acknowledged that he possessed serious personal problems that would have made him difficult to work with, regardless of political context. The truth probably incorporated elements from multiple explanations. Marinesko appears to have been a tactically brilliant, but personally difficult individual whose achievements occurred at an inconvenient time and place for Soviet authorities seeking to control military narratives. Psychological speculation attempted to explain how someone could function so effectively under combat stress while proving unable to adapt to peacetime requirements. Some observers suggested that Marinesko suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, manifesting in alcohol dependency and conflicts with authority. More controversial were suggestions that Marinesko's ethnic background, his Romanian father and multicultural upbringing in Odessa, made him suspect to Soviet authorities who preferred ethnically Russian heroes. While no direct evidence supported this theory, it aligned with documented patterns of discrimination against minority populations during the Stalin era. International speculation focused on whether other navies had achieved comparable results that remained classified or unrecognized. Some Western naval historians suggested that German or American submarine commanders had accomplished similar feats but received different treatment from their respective governments. The persistence of these debates reflected broader questions about how nations choose to remember military heroes and what qualities they celebrate or suppress. Marinesko's story became a lens through which observers examined the relationship between individual achievement and state authority, between tactical brilliance and political reliability, between wartime necessity and peacetime values. Ultimately, the speculation surrounding Marinesko revealed as much about the observers as about their subject. Each theory reflected particular assumptions about human nature, political systems, and the moral complexities of warfare that shaped how different audiences interpreted his controversial legacy. The rehabilitation of Alexander Marinesko's reputation coincided with broader changes in how post-Soviet society understood military heroism and individual achievement. His story became a powerful symbol that resonated across multiple areas of contemporary culture, from military education to popular entertainment to national identity formation. Within the Russian Navy, Marinesko's tactical methods became standard curriculum at submarine warfare schools. Officers studying his approaches to target identification, attack positioning, and tactical decision-making under pressure could now acknowledge their source. The Marinesko doctrine, emphasizing aggressive action, tactical flexibility, and independent judgment, influenced an entire generation of submarine commanders who came of age during the nuclear submarine era. Naval academies throughout the former Soviet Union established Marinesko memorial programs that combined tactical instruction with character development. These programs emphasized not just his tactical achievements, but also the importance of moral courage in challenging unjust authority, a lesson that carried obvious relevance for officers serving in transitional political systems. The cultural impact extended far beyond military circles. Russian filmmakers discovered in Marinesko's story the kind of dramatic narrative that Soviet cinema had systematically ignored. A tale of individual heroism crushed by bureaucratic incompetence and political paranoia. The 1991 film Admiral of the Fleet portrayed Marinesko as a tragic hero whose greatest enemy was not German submarines, but Soviet politics. Literature embraced his story with equal enthusiasm. Novels, memoirs, and historical accounts began appearing throughout the 1990s, each offering different interpretations of his character and significance. Some portrayed him as a pure hero betrayed by an ungrateful system, others as a flawed genius whose personal demons ultimately destroyed him, and still others as a symbol of the broader tragedy that befell an entire generation of Soviet veterans. Popular culture transformed Marinesko into a figure comparable to other rehabilitated heroes like Marshal Zhukov or Admiral Kuznetsov. His image appeared on commemorative stamps, naval insignia, and museum displays throughout Russia and former Soviet republics. Submarine museums featured detailed exhibits about his tactics and achievements, often contrasting his treatment with that received by Western submarine aces. The internet age brought new dimensions to Marinesko's cultural presence. Naval history enthusiasts created websites dedicated to analyzing his tactical methods, comparing his achievements to those of submarine commanders from other nations, and debating the moral complexities of his wartime actions. Online forums allowed veterans and historians to share previously unpublished photographs, documents, and personal recollections. Video games focusing on submarine warfare began incorporating scenarios based on Marinesko's actual attacks. Players could attempt to replicate his tactical decisions while learning about the challenges faced by submarine commanders operating in the confined waters of the Baltic Sea. These games introduced his story to international audiences who might never have encountered it through traditional media. Academic interest in Marinesko's case extended beyond military history into fields like psychology, sociology, and political science. Researchers studying the relationship between individual achievement and institutional authority found his story particularly relevant. How do organizations balance the need for creative, independent thinking with requirements for discipline and conformity? Marinesko's career provided a stark example of what happens when these forces come into conflict. International naval communities began acknowledging Marinesko's achievements within the broader context of submarine warfare history. Western naval historians, initially skeptical of Soviet claims about wartime accomplishments, gradually recognized that his tactical successes were genuine and significant. Professional military journals published articles analyzing his methods and comparing them to those employed by German, American, and British submarine commanders. The symbolic power of Marinesko's story proved particularly important for post-Soviet military culture, struggling to define new values and traditions. His example suggested that true military excellence required not just technical competence and physical courage, but also the moral courage to challenge authority when necessary, even when such challenges carried personal costs. Contemporary Russian military doctrine incorporated lessons from Marinesko's career in unexpected ways. Training programs for submarine commanders emphasized the importance of tactical flexibility and independent decision-making, while also warning about the personal costs of excessive conflicts with superior officers. The message was subtle but clear. Be brilliant like Marinesko, but avoid his political mistakes. Memorial culture surrounding Marinesko reflected broader changes in how post-Soviet society remembered its military history. Unlike the sanitized heroic narratives of the communist era, Marinesko's story acknowledged both triumph and tragedy, individual brilliance, and systemic failure. His monuments and memorials carried inscriptions emphasizing his tactical achievements, while implicitly criticizing the system that had destroyed his career. The resonance of his story extended beyond military and historical circles into popular consciousness. Opinion polls conducted during the 2000s showed that ordinary Russians ranked Marinesko among their most admired military figures, often ahead of officially celebrated heroes whose achievements were less dramatic but politically acceptable. His influence on contemporary submarine commanders proved measurable through tactical innovations and operational philosophy. Russian submarine officers trained in the post-Soviet era demonstrated higher levels of tactical aggressiveness and independent judgment than their predecessors, reflecting educational programs that emphasized Marinesko's methods alongside traditional doctrines. The broader narrative of Alexander Marinesko's career intersected with numerous other stories that illuminate both his individual achievements and the context in which they occurred. These parallel tales reveal the complex web of relationships, rivalries, and circumstances that shaped submarine warfare in the Baltic Sea during the final years of the Second World War. Among the crew members of S-13, several individuals achieved their own forms of distinction that reflected differently on their commander's leadership abilities. Senior Lieutenant Sergei Burov, Marinesko's executive officer during the Wilhelm Gustloff attack, continued his naval career after the war and eventually commanded his own submarine. Burov's memoirs, published in 1978, provided detailed accounts of serving under Marinesko that emphasized his tactical brilliance while acknowledging his personal difficulties. Torpedo specialist Anatoly Krivalev, who had been instrumental in maintaining S-13's weapon systems, became one of the most vocal advocates for Marinesko's rehabilitation during the 1980s. Krivalev's technical expertise lent credibility to his accounts of the submarine's combat operations, and his detailed knowledge of torpedo performance helped historians understand exactly how Marinesko had achieved his remarkable success rates. Chief Petty Officer Ivan Sipko, responsible for sonar operations aboard S-13, developed detection techniques that became standard practice throughout the Baltic Fleet. His innovations in acoustic analysis, refined during Marinesko's aggressive patrol schedule, contributed significantly to Soviet submarine effectiveness during the war's final months. Sipko's post-war career in naval intelligence provided him with perspectives on Marinesko's strategic importance that crew members in other positions lacked. The fate of other Baltic Fleet submarine commanders during the same period illustrated the exceptional nature of Marinesko's achievements. Captain Lieutenant Boris Korolev, commanding submarine L3, operated in similar waters but achieved only modest success despite following orthodox tactics approved by fleet headquarters. His careful adherence to official procedures produced few enemy contacts and even fewer successful attacks. Captain Second Rank Vladimir Konovalov, one of the most decorated submarine commanders in the Soviet Navy, operated primarily in Arctic waters, where conditions differed dramatically from the Baltic. Konovalov's success against German shipping in the Barents Sea demonstrated that exceptional submarine commanders could achieve results in various environments, but also highlighted how Marinesko's accomplishments in the more restricted Baltic were particularly impressive. The German perspective on Baltic submarine warfare provided additional context for evaluating Marinesko's impact. Kapitän zur See Hans Rudolf Rösing, responsible for German anti-submarine operations in the Baltic, identified S-13 specifically as the most dangerous Soviet submarine under his operational area. German naval intelligence files, captured after the war, contained detailed analyses of Soviet submarine tactics that consistently identified Marinesko's methods as the most effective and unpredictable. Korvettenkapitän Wilhelm Zahn, who survived the sinking of Wilhelm Gustloff, spent decades researching the circumstances of the attack. His account, published in West Germany during the 1970s, provided German confirmation of the tactical skill demonstrated by S-13's crew. Despite the personal tragedy he had experienced, Zahn acknowledged that Marinesko had executed a textbook submarine attack under challenging conditions. The broader context of Operation Hannibal revealed how Marinesko's attacks fit into the larger strategic picture of the war's final months. Admiral Oskar Kumitz, responsible for coordinating German naval evacuations, later testified that the loss of Wilhelm Gustloff and General von Steuben significantly disrupted evacuation schedules and forced changes in routing that reduced overall evacuation efficiency. Soviet naval intelligence operations supporting Baltic Fleet submarines remained largely classified until the 1990s. When these files became available, they revealed that Marinesko had indeed received more detailed intelligence about German shipping movements than previously acknowledged. Radio intercepts, reconnaissance reports, and intelligence from partisan networks provided submarine commanders with information that significantly enhanced their effectiveness. The role of weather and environmental conditions in Marinesko's success became clearer through meteorological records preserved in various archives. The winter of 1944 to 1945 featured unusual ice conditions that forced German vessels to use specific shipping lanes that submarine commanders could predict and exploit. Marinesko's understanding of these environmental factors contributed to his ability to position S-13 for optimal attacks. Post-war investigations into German casualty figures from Marinesko's attacks revealed discrepancies in various official accounts. Soviet sources initially underestimated the human cost of the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking, while German sources sometimes exaggerated casualty figures for propaganda purposes. Modern historical analysis suggests that approximately 9,000 people died in the Gustloff sinking and 3,000 in the General von Steuben attack, figures that make these among the deadliest maritime disasters in history. The technical specifications of Marinesko's targets provided insight into why his attacks were so devastating. Both Wilhelm Gustloff and General von Steuben had been converted from passenger service to military transport duties, but retained structural characteristics that made them vulnerable to torpedo attack. Their large size and high passenger capacity meant that damage control efforts were overwhelmed by the scale of flooding caused by multiple torpedo hits. The psychological impact of Marinesko's attacks on German naval personnel extended far beyond the immediate tactical consequences. Survivor accounts and intelligence reports indicated that German naval crews became increasingly reluctant to serve aboard large transports after news of the attacks spread. This morale effect multiplied the strategic impact of the actual sinkings. Intelligence gathered from German prisoners and defectors revealed that Marinesko's reputation among enemy forces exceeded that of any other Soviet submarine commander. German naval personnel specifically discussed the threat posed by S-13 and attempted to modify their operational procedures to avoid encounters with Marinesko's submarine. The stories of civilian refugees aboard Marinesko's targets added human dimensions that purely military accounts often overlooked. Families fleeing the advancing Soviet army found themselves caught between the advancing land forces they were escaping and the submarine forces that attacked their escape vessels. Their testimonies, preserved in various refugee organizations, provided sobering reminders of warfare's impact on non-combatants. These parallel stories and hidden details combined to create a more complete picture of Alexander Marinesko's significance than any single narrative could provide. His achievements occurred within a complex web of relationships, circumstances, and consequences that extended far beyond his individual actions. Understanding these broader connections helps explain both his tactical success and the complicated legacy that followed his wartime triumphs. The accumulated weight of these various accounts, testimonies, and documentation established beyond reasonable doubt that Marinesko had indeed accomplished what his supporters claimed. He had executed the most successful submarine patrol in maritime history while operating under some of the most challenging conditions any submarine commander had ever faced. The tragedy lay not in questioning his achievements, but in understanding how such exceptional military service could result in personal destruction and decades of official obscurity.